Welcome to the future. Thank you, thank you. So we're going to get sci-fi today, if you haven't figured it out already, and we're going to get into a bunch of sort of way science fiction depicts the future of money, banking, and payments, and these sort of things, and see if we can glean some grasp of how the future might evolve over the next 100 or 200 years in respect to banking and payments. So let's kick it off. When we talk about these futures, and whenever you're trying to look at forecasting, or in the sort of futurism business, we call it super forecasting. When you're trying to do this, this is not fortune telling. It's not predicting the future. It is scenario planning. And essentially, when we look at these types of depictions of the future, they are possible futures. Now, there are likely paths that humanity will take, particularly as a result of things like artificial intelligence and climate change, which will take us down particular paths. But having said that, all of these futures we look at today are potential futures. But when you look at science fiction and its depiction in the media, from a storytelling perspective, there's a lot that it gets obviously wrong, which is interesting. Having said that, science fiction informs so much of what we talk about in the future. Do you remember Captain Kirk on Star Trek with the communicator? Well, this informed, of course, the development of Motorola's StarTech mobile phone, the flip phone over those years. And a lot of the future that we try and build comes from science fiction creating ideas. So at the same time, it's sort of this very interesting circle of how the future might pan out. But let me get started with some historical. I'm going to take these glasses off because I can't really see through them. But it was a good idea right at the start. But let's go back in history at some sort of early science fiction. This is Edward Bellamy. He wrote this book, sort of looking, and this was in the late 1800s, looking at what the future of the world would be like in the year 2000. And this was the first depiction in modern literature, if you call 1890 modern literature, of a form factor like a credit card that we have today. So Edward Bellamy essentially predicted the development of credit cards. Now, what was controversial about this was not a payment device that you would use instead of cash or bills of exchange like checks or things like this. But the controversial thing was that women could use this credit card. And in the late 1800s, this was a very controversial type of statement to make in literature, that women who didn't even have the right to vote at this point would have the right to have their own bank account without their husband's involvement and so forth. So this science fiction asks these difficult questions. Science fiction often is able to depict elements of society in terms of things that we have questions about, and show different viewpoints of the future that we couldn't necessarily have a social commentary on, in a normal, civilized manner, because science fiction allows us to sort of take ourselves out of the current political and social environment and sort of think differently. But remember this. Remember that the most controversial point of Edward Bellamy's writing at this point was that women would be able to use this payment instrument, which today we call a credit card. Of course, today, a credit card is 1970s technology in a 21st century world. You heard me say that before, Balash, right? We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago in Hungary. And if we look at the development of technologies today in respect to banking and payments, things are happening very rapidly. Obviously, everyone's talking about ChatGPT now. Artificial intelligence is going to radically change the way we think about banking and payments just over the next few years. And of course, as the impacts of this on society will be quite interesting. But when we look at certain elements science fiction didn't necessarily catch them or missed out on them. For example, cryptocurrencies. The really first use of cryptocurrencies in sort of science fiction literature was Neil Stephenson's work called Cryptonomicon. And this was very early in the process, a little bit before the emergence of Bitcoin. Of course, Neil Stephenson's also famous for his novel Snow Crash, where he predicted the metaverse. In fact, the term metaverse really comes from Snow Crash. And it was going to be made into a HBO series. I don't think that's happening now. But Neil Stephenson has recently started his own metaverse company called Lamina One, and they've raised a ton of money. So it'll be really interesting to see how sort of the science fiction creator of the vision of the metaverse ends up actually operationally executing on something around the metaverse. But if you're familiar with Snow Crash and the hero, which is hero protagonist, is his main character in Snow Crash, it raises some very interesting questions about how the world will change with this sort of metaverse reality and how people might live. The protagonist in Snow Crash lives in a storage compartment, you know, one of those storage units, and he has this massive computer interface in there with his smart glasses he uses to interface in the metaverse. Of course, you've probably seen Ready Player One as well as a depiction of the metaverse. And in each of these stories, we see the depiction of payment schemes. So in Ready Player One, you have the Parzival, the main metaverse character, in a store buying this haptic boot suit where he interacts with this storefront, and his wallet is sort of built into the metaverse infrastructure. If we look at the way banking is depicted in science fiction, not great video quality here, but this is from the remake of the film Total Impact with Colin Farrell. And in this, he goes into a bank branch, and yes, he has to use iris scan, but he has to give a bank account number to access his safety deposit box. Now, we're not going to have bank account numbers in 2040. They're going to be hash graphs or something like that. You're not going to have a bank account number. And in terms of identity, he goes into the safety deposit box, and you can see him here looking at his safety deposit box, and he pulls out physical passports. Right? Well, you're not going to have physical passports in the year 2040 either. So this is sort of crazy. And of course, in terms of the story as it goes, one of the other things is he's also got his cash, which is for United Federation of Britain, and it's got a bummer's photo on it. I don't know how that works, but are we going to use physical cash in the 2040s? This is a common mistake that many science fiction movies make when it comes to banking. You see, the main character having to deal with cash in some setting, because his identity's been stolen or something like this in this scenario. But physical cash is already on the decline. There's only a few economies where cash is sort of remaining stable, and the introduction of mobile wallets and the improvement in financial inclusion brought about by smartphones means on a trajectory basis that we're probably not going to be using cash in the future. But we will be using things like biometrics. And so you've no doubt seen Minority Report with Tom Cruise, and in this there's a depiction of facial recognition using iris scanning. So as he walks through this shopping mall environment, you can see that he's getting messages that are personalized to him in terms of advertising. He's an Amex member since 2037. Again, we're not going to have plastic cards, so this is where it got wrong. But we are already starting to use facial recognition. China, of course, Alipay, Tencent WeChat Pay use facial recognition more broadly. As you come into European ports, you use facial recognition for passport control. Biometrics is going to be a much more efficient way to secure payments and banking in the future than, a signature, a first-century artifact that is no longer secure. But this sort of depiction of facial recognition and so forth in terms of its use, again, there are social implications in terms of the adoption of these types of elements of biometrics and so forth that we have to consider. This is a great quote from William Gibson from his book Count Zero, where he sort of depicts that the use of money in the future is going to change significantly in terms of cash. It's not that cash will be illegal in the future, but there's just no way you're going to be able to practically use it. And so this is probably, I think from my perspective, the most realistic depiction of how cash is going to be utilized in the future. It's not that cash will be illegal to use. You can keep cash if you want, but in terms of inflationary pressure, in terms of modality of use and so forth, it's going to be largely impractical. Also, if you look at the smart economies of the 2050s and so forth, most of these economies will work on a highly automated basis. Physical cash doesn't automate. You have to have programmable money, whether it's a CBDC or whether it's stable coins or tokens or some other form of programmable money we haven't necessarily thought of yet. The use of physical cash won't work in these highly automated societies. So, just like William Gibson said, it's not that it's going to be illegal, you just won't be able to do anything useful with physical cash in the future. Now, for banks who still deal with physical cash, this might come as a shock, but if you are in the Chinese market, as an example, in 2012, if you'd gone to visit China, 97% of all retail transactions were cash-based in China. Today, 86% of retail transactions in China are done on mobile wallets. And if you had visited China in the early 2010s and someone suggested to you by 2020 the majority of retail transactions would be cashless, you would have said, that's ridiculous, this is China, you don't have any idea what you're saying. And yet, in just 10 years, the landscape has completely changed. So if you're thinking what William Gibson is saying is sort of out there, we have seen the very reality of this happening in the Chinese economy just over the last decade. Now, other depictions of currency are quite interesting. This is Cyberpunk 2077, a video game that's been popularized. And in this, the euro and the dollar have combined to form a global currency called the Eurodollar. They are nicknamed eddies in the cyberpunk universe. And the concept of sort of a centralized global currency is something you also see depicted in many science fiction movies. But actually, the reality is we're probably going to see much more fragmentation of currency in the future. We're going to see a lot different choices, primarily because programmability of money means you're going to have to build money for purpose. And so machine-to-machine transactions aren't necessarily going to create the necessity for a global currency like is depicted in Cyberpunk. But it's interesting sort of thought exercise to see, would there be benefit in having a global currency from a trading perspective, or would this be more complicated than it's worth in terms of trying to get this? Look at what's happened in European Union. Not every country has aligned itself with the euro. We still have some players in the European Union that have their own currencies. And of course, this was part of the debate behind Brexit as well. And of course, when we look at universes like the Star Wars universe, we see this sort of concept that capitalism sort of wins out as this model of the way economies should work in the future. Let me just play a couple of videos in terms of how money is depicted in the Star Wars universe, so you get a picture of that.
Let's just say we'd like to avoid any imperial entanglements.
Well, that's the real trick, isn't it? And it's going to cost you something extra. 10,000, all in advance.
10,000? I'd almost buy our own ship for that.
Saying of which, how's he gonna pay for all of this?
I have 20,000 Republic Dactaries.
Republic credits? Republic credits are no good out here. I need something more real.
I don't have anything else, but credits will do fine.
No, they won't.
Credits will do fine.
No, they won't. What do you think?
Introduce myself and assure you that your business will continue to thrive under my watchful eye.
Thank you, Lord.
Who expects to be using coins in the future? I mean, we don't really even use coins today. So why would the Star Wars universe use these physical coins as currency? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. As I said, as we saw in that little trailer at the start, the concept that you can have artificial intelligence and hyperdrive and longevity extension technologies and all of this, and you're still using paper currency or coins made out of metals or alloys are sort of ridiculous. But this sort of issue about sort of science fiction depicting sort of the political and social norms that we have today and trying to extend that is a theme that we do see within science fiction. So a lot of science fiction becomes ideological in that respect. If you take American sci-fi, for example, a lot of American sci-fi sort of basically maintains this belief set that capitalism is the best system the world will ever find, and so therefore all science fiction of the future is based on capitalist principles. And a good example of that is, again, the original Total Recall movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and this is a scene where they've cut off the air to the Martian colony. Now, in advance, I'll apologize for some of the language that the main character here is going to use, but this is the depiction of pure capitalism in the form of in the future.
Sir, the oxygen level is bottoming
Sorry, can
out
we have
in
the volume up?
Sector G. What do you want me to do about it?
Don't do anything.
But they won't last an hour, sir.
Fuck them. Be a good lesson to the others.
Come on, Cohagen, you got what you want. Give these people air.
My friend, in 5 minutes you won't give a shit about the people. Fire it up, Doc.
Excuse me, Doctor.
Give these
You gotta
people
remember,
air, as Arnie said. So
really?
air and water in these Martian colonies were a currency that people that worked for these corporations that had built these colonies on Mars, they had to work in order to qualify to get air and water, basic sustenance. This is pure form of capitalism, that humanity, as we expand into the universe, is going to still have this class of sort of neo-feudalist owners that own infrastructure and, this economic slave class. And this is depicted in terms of American science fiction. Another example of this is the Expanse universe. If, again, scientifically speaking, Expanse is probably one of the best science fiction series produced in the last couple of decades, actually, in terms of its scientific accuracy. But listen to the depiction of the Belters. These are workers in the asteroid belt in terms of what they have to deal with in this environment.
Ceres was once covered in ice. Enough water for 1,000 generations. Until Earth and Mars stripped it away for themselves. This station became the most vital port in the belt. But the immense wealth and resources that flow through our gates were never meant for us. Belters worked the docks, loading and unloading precious cargo. We fixed the pipes and filters that keep this rock living and breathing. We Belters toil and suffer, without hope and without end. And for what? One day Mars will use its might to wrest control of Ceres from Earth, and Earth will go to war to take it back. It's all the same to us. No matter who controls Ceres, our home, to them, we will always be slaves. That's all we are to the earthers and dusters.
Again, this depiction of this sort of economic slavery as a form of super capitalism, that you have the haves and the have-nots, you have the workers and the owners of this infrastructure and so forth. Now, if you think about this in realistic terms, just knowing our own history over the last few hundred years, the likelihood that the capitalist society that we see in the West, globally, generally today, will survive over the next, 100 or 200 years, based just on history, is fairly slim. Because we're always evolving political systems, we're always evolving economic systems. And, if we look at the richest economy in the world today, the United States, where they can't even provide basic healthcare, education, and housing for their populace, then there's obviously functional issues with the system. They thought that in 10,000 years, that the most efficient form of economics we will ever find is capitalism is sort of laughable. And yet you see a lot of sort of the way we depict science fiction is super technology imposed on the existing political and social infrastructure from an ideological perspective. But actually, it's probably fairly likely, if we take the likes of a Martian colony, as we're going to talk about in a moment, that they may develop a very different type of economic system in the future. And one of those potential futures is the Star Trek universe. And you might have to pump up the volume on this one because it's a little bit difficult to hear, but this is what Jean-Luc Picard of the Enterprise said about the economics of the 24th century.
How much does this thing cost?
The economics of the future is somewhat different. You see, money doesn't exist in the 24th century.
No money? You mean you don't get paid?
The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity.
Now, this is also an ideological statement, but you couldn't call this necessarily communism or socialism, although Americans watching this would probably think of this as techno-communism. But this is what we call the post-scarcity abundance world. And this is an economic theory that comes from the singularity universe, right? That the singularity and artificial intelligence will create this abundance in terms of our ability. We'll have free energy, we'll have better resource allocation, we'll be able to mine asteroids from the asteroid belt and so forth, that will bring us this abundance that means that wealth and money essentially become meaningless in this environment. So these are sort of two competing fields of view if you look at science fiction stories that are depicted. You get these sort of yin and yang, a super capitalist future or something that is sort of utopian in this respect. But having said that, there are still functional issues in the Star Trek universe that abundance doesn't necessarily fix. But this sort of techno-utopian view, probably one of the better, more fleshed out approaches to this is Ian Banks's Culture series. If you're not familiar with Ian Banks, and you're into sci-fi, you should definitely check out the Culture series. Very interesting. But the humans in this are advanced augmented humans that can essentially live thousands of years. And in this environment, they have post-scarcity environment, so energy and computing resources are limitless. And exploring what that world might be like from an economic perspective is very interesting. The starships that have AIs that drive these starships become major personalities in the local sort of solar system and galaxy in terms of their power as well, sort of super AI structures. Interestingly, Elon Musk must be a fan of Ian Banks because the two ocean-going drones where they land the SpaceX Falcon 9 rockets on out in the ocean, he calls them, "Of Course I Still Love You," and the other one, I can't remember their second drone, but both are named for starships out of the Culture series. But this post-scarcity world is interesting to explore. If we take one asteroid from the asteroid belt, Psyche 16, this is an asteroid that later this year NASA and SpaceX are sending a probe to. This single asteroid today would be worth, in terms of just pure raw materials, metals, alloys, and so forth on this rock, would be worth 100,000 times global GDP. That's one asteroid. So, once we have the ability to get access to resources in the solar system, helium-3 on the moon, the various gases in the gas giants, the asteroid belt and so forth, then the traditional commodities market that we have on Earth will be essentially rendered useless because the availability of these very cheap resources will be, this post-scarcity abundance world. Computing power, artificial intelligence, solving problems like longevity and diseases and, some of the more intractable problems that we've had, they, I think, will be greater incentives than profitability. I think profitability, in the way we think about the capitalist market, will eventually be unpopular for humanity because there's only so much we can evolve as a human species based on these technologies. But what about the future? Think about maybe colonizing Mars, and this is sort of a depiction from a few different sci-fi series on this, Expanse and some other things. If we were to create a city on Mars, Elon wants 1 million people on Mars by 2100, what would that Martian economy look like? Would it operate like the economy on Earth? Well, the overriding intent, even if you want to terraform Mars, in the initial instance must be the survivability of the colony. Both Chris and I have talked about this in our books, but that Martian economic system that would emerge has to be geared towards the survivability of the colony. If the starships stop coming from Earth to bring food, self-sustainability and self-sufficiency is most critical. Not producing profits for the SpaceX corporation to send back to the Earth. That's not the overriding driver for a colony like this. So there is a very good chance that a colony on Mars, for example, would produce a sort of collective view of sustainable prosperity. That the Martians, as a colony, would be focused on what can we do to make Mars as self-sufficient and as successful and as independent from the Earth's economic system as quickly as possible. And in the Mars trilogy, which is Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, written by Kim Stanley Robinson, one of the best eco-sci-fi guys, he proposes this eco-economics. Eco-poetics, which basically is that people that are living on Mars, their wealth is generated by how much net energy they put back into the system, how much air they create versus how much air they consume, how much food they grow instead of food they consume. And so this sort of would be a better system for the planet in terms of both Mars and Earth than the current system we have, which is to profit on resources that we take out of the ground, for example, or production in factories. So this could be the sort of two competing themes. And in the Mars trilogy, Kim Stanley Robinson proposes that the big corporations, which he calls transnationals, will then use the United Nations to attempt to take over Mars because of the threat ideologically to capitalism that's on the Earth system, Earth versus Mars. So this is an interesting depiction of how these economic systems might happen. But when you read Heinlein and other science fiction authors, many of them talk about this time when humanity has evolved beyond this sort of scarcity issue that we have. The problem of homelessness, the problem of people not being able to afford health care or afford to send their children to schools, or just being able to afford a quality of life, a basic quality of life. Now, economists have debated whether this sort of economic utopia is possible. Some have said it would be possible if every human on the planet had a lower standard of living, but we can't all live like Americans and Western Europeans in terms of the quality of life, because if you have to give that quality of life to Africans, for example, the amount of money that you'd have to put into the system to give them that quality of life would mean the global economy would no longer work. But that's capitalist thinking. That's not thinking that is human first. If you're human first, if you take an Aristotelian view of philosophy, then you would have to say that if we want the ultimate optimal existence for humanity in the future, then it has to be that every human life is valuable. And if so, we have to change the way we prioritize economic systems to value every human's existence over that of some humans versus another. But 99% of human history has essentially been feudalist. So that's the problem we're fighting against, swimming upstream, if you like. And again, that sort of feudal system, we see this emerging in science fiction as well. Did any of you guys see the new Dune movie? Spectacular visual movie, but also a really interesting commentary. Now, the Dune novel was originally written by Frank Herbert in, I think, 1956. Does that sound right, Chris? Something about that? It's certainly very early. But if you read that, then this was a view of sort of resource scarcity. The spice was what enabled interstellar travel in the Dune universe. And it was the most scarce, most valuable sort of resource on the planet. And so this sort of feudal scarcity, where these resources continue to be controlled by a very small cabal or group of the richest people, is again something that extends on this sort of super capitalist theme. And this leads to sort of this dystopian versus utopian. What's interesting is when we read Russian science fiction, it's quite different from that of American science fiction. It tends to be quite dystopian often. And you can understand coming up through the communist system why that might be the case. But when you look at Chinese science fiction, these are communist utopias. They suggest that communism is going to be the best system that was ever created as well. So there is a lot of politics that comes into these plays. But that's not necessarily the way that things are going to develop. And of course, the scariest is sort of, if you take the Republican right-wing view of the future, where it becomes a theocracy, essentially. What did the Newsroom, that TV show? Jeff Daniels was the anchor, and he said, that the Tea Party was the American Taliban. And, if you look at some of the policy decisions most recently in the United States, we can see this type of religious fervor creeping in. But again, with the emergence of artificial intelligence and so forth, we think that this is probably going to weaken those religious structures over time. Not necessarily dissolve them, but certainly weaken that. And then we have some real practical elements. We have the Einsteinian transaction limit, or we have the speed of light. And so in this depiction in science fiction from Charles Stross, slow money transactions were part of what kept the economy of the solar system under control, because there were limitations in terms of how quickly you could move money. Sort of like the American wire transfer and ACH system today versus the European system or Chinese system, and as a natural limit on the way economies might develop. And then you have, from Black Mirror, the reputation economy. This appears in a number of books, as you can see, where in this episode you have people getting scored with their social media, and what sort of house they could rent or what sort of car they could buy was all determined by their reputation score. And so reputation increasingly has become a part of our sort of metrics in society, where you have social media influencers who are able to make millions of dollars a year because of their social media influence. The question is, could this extend to a larger basis where this becomes a currency of sorts for individuals? Well, it's unlikely, but at the same time, who would have predicted social media influencers and things like that, and TikTok influencers and YouTubers making money out of this. Now we have people who are prompters that can put AI prompts together and things like this for generative AI. So we are continuously generating these new types of careers that take our economy in different ways as well. But I just want to wrap up with sort of these thoughts about what the smart economy of the future might look like. Now, obviously, one of the primary things we're going to have to do over the next 70 years or so is look at mitigation of climate change. Part of that is resilience in infrastructure, but we may even be building seawalls to defend against sea level rise. Now, Netherlands, of course, is a country that's very experienced at building levees and so forth, but this is a depiction from that series, The Expanse, showing what New York is going to be like in the future, with these massive seawalls around the city of New York built to defend New York against sea rise. The economy that's likely to be most affected by sea rise globally is actually Miami. We believe that by 2045, 80% of Miami-Dade County will be underwater. Now, in the case of, if you look at policy in Florida right now, there is no intent to fix that problem. So there is a thought by various futurists, such as Parag Khanna from Climate Alpha, that most likely Miami is just going to be a victim of climate change because the cost to prevent the damage to Miami in terms of sea level rise is politically untenable. No one would be able to be elected in Florida to spend the sort of billions of dollars required to defend Florida against sea level rise. But for New York, because it's the financial capital of the United States and arguably the world, this is a cost that's too great. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how we deal with the economics of climate change in the future. We also have AI-based unemployment. This is a big discussion right now with ChatGPT. What's going to happen when AI disrupts employment? And this is a very real element of what we've got to think about in the future. What is the role of work for humans in this future world? How do we deal with a world that's highly automated? The most successful economies of the future will be highly autonomous. That means less human workers. What do you do with human workers that can't work? How do they live? How do you afford housing and healthcare and education and food when you can't work because an AI has taken your job? Now, the argument from capitalists is every time we've created new technologies like this, we've also created new jobs. But we've never had a technology that can disrupt every form of human labor simultaneously at once, which artificial general intelligence will be. And we've already seen the trend that automation has produced less working hours. So we are working less. We're getting paid less. You know, wages in the UK and the United States and Australia haven't kept up with CPI increases for 40 years now. This is why people can't afford the same things they did just 40 years ago. So in the future, maybe we'll have things like universal basic income. If we don't have universal basic income, then we'll have social revolution, because the higher levels of unemployment produced by artificial intelligence will create massive social conflict. So this in itself produces a very interesting economic question. Who's going to pay for universal basic income? Or maybe we'll create new types of currency, like central bank digital currencies, which will be a new supply of money in addition to the M0 supply. But you know, that has complications in itself. And maybe we'll create currencies that are built towards greening the planet. In The Ministry of the Future, again, a Kim Stanley Robinson book, he depicts this future world and says we need to create a global currency that is based on carbon output and that is based on regenerating the planet and undoing the damage we've done from climate change. It's a very interesting sort of thought process in this. I do recommend you read it if you can. We are going to have to incentivize things like carbon capture in the future to basically accelerate recovery of the planet. But this will be able to use, carbon will then be able to use things like new battery technologies and even things, exotic things like space elevators in the future potentially. And we'll have tons of cheap energy. Just by 2030, about 50 million people globally will be employed retooling the energy system. And the Ukraine conflict, Ukraine-Russia conflict has accelerated the adoption of renewables in the European Union. So, you know, this is one thing we say is a positive outcome for what Putin's done in Ukraine. And homelessness will be a thing of the past with 3D printed homes. This model home here could be printed in just the space of 24 hours for the cost of about $3,000 or $4,000. On that basis, homelessness doesn't need to exist unless you've got an economic incentive to keep homelessness going, which is crazy. In the United States, the average cost of having a homeless person on the streets now is $100,000 a year. That's what it costs in policing and social costs to have someone homeless on the streets of America. And yet, why can't we build housing for them? It's not an economic problem. It's a policy problem in this case. Food scarcity is going to be a problem in the future, but we are looking at technologies that can deal with that, such as urban farming, vertical farms that are 90% more efficient in terms of water use than traditional farming methods. And of course, reducing the carbon footprint of cows means we're going to be starting to produce lab-grown proteins, lab-grown meats, chicken, seafood. This is already reaching commercial-grade technology soon. So imagine having a burger and not knowing whether that burger came from an actual cow or an e-cow in a lab. This is the future we're going to have over the next few years. But this means food scarcity may not be as much of an issue as it will be for a short period of time as a result of climate change. And lastly, technologies like the metaverse will allow us to deliver ubiquitous education, high quality, high grade education to everybody as long as they've got digital access, as long as they have digital inclusion with a smartphone device or in the future smart glasses. So these are the practical solutions we see emerging for a very different world in the future. But not all of them are compatible with the way we think about capitalism and so forth today. Health tech that extends longevity, gene therapy that eliminates diseases out of the genome, these are all part of the really exciting futures that we have in the future. But these are not necessarily commercial ideas in that sense because they fly against the face of traditional thinking. 3D printed bio-organs. So if in the future you need a transplant, instead of taking someone else's organ, we'll 3D print you a new heart or a new set of lungs or a new liver using your own cells to culture a grown 3D printed organ. And in the future, we may mix in other species. For example, if you have a problem with your heart and you need a pacemaker, maybe we'll put electric eel cells in your heart so we regulate the electrical signals in your heart better. Sound crazy? Well, we're already using transgenics in food production and things like that today. So this is where genetic science is taking us. And robot prosthetics is something that will enable us to eliminate the future of the word disability. You know, we'll have people that will be able to, that have lost their limbs, be able to have, robot arms that are better than the limbs that they were originally given, giving sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and so forth. These are all technical challenges that are well within the grasp of humanity now. And maybe we'll live for 250 or 300 years by the end of this century. That's certainly a possibility. Aubrey de Grey, who's one of the world's leading experts on longevity, says 2036 will be the year that humanity reaches longevity escape velocity. Longevity escape velocity means that we will be able to stop aging in 2036. And for every decade after that, we'll be able to reduce our cellular age over time. So if you can make it to 2036, you've got a good chance of living to 200. Yes. So, what does this require? Well, this sort of future requires us to think very differently about the type of governance and economic structures that we'll need in the future. And while automation is going to solve many of the problems we think of in terms of production and supply chain and things like that, the biggest challenge for the financial system in the future, particularly one that's automated by smart contracts and AI and central bank digital currencies, is that it doesn't make any sense to have a national policy on central bank digital currencies that only is restricted to that one geography. Even if you think about the world and the way we trade today and the way we do business, you know, the geographical boundaries we have of the 19th century don't make a lot of sense in today's world in respect to commerce. Even less so when we talk about automating regulation in respect to financial services and artificial intelligence in the future. So global regulation is going to be a thing. global data sharing. If you want to stop anti-money laundering, you don't get bankers going through printed reports and trying to identify suspicious transactions. You use data mining across border. But this requires global governance. And artificial intelligence, it doesn't make sense for China to have regulations on AI and the US to have a different set of regulations. We need global standards in terms of ethics that AI operates in. This requires global agreement and global governance. Now, this is not global government. We're not talking about the UN becoming the world's government. We are talking about regulation, though, becoming automated, based in code, and that having to be agreed upon on at least a regional basis, if not global. So these are the 4 potential scenarios that we mapped out in the book, The Rise of Technosocialism for the Future. And these are based upon 2 sort of broad schemes, right? So you've got whether economies are collectively focused or individually focused. So capitalism, particularly the US version of capitalism, is much more individualistic. Whereas if you look at Europe, we tend to have more democratic social policy here, so more collective view. Then you have chaotic futures versus planned futures. In the chaotic futures, we have either the collective failure, where we try and reduce the impact of artificial intelligence so we can keep people working in jobs, so we don't have to worry about universal basic income or social schemes, but this ultimately restricts the growth and innovation of humanity. Or we just wait too long to act against climate change, as an example, and we have progressive failures of economies because we just waited too long. We didn't anticipate the rate of change. But the 2 probably competing systems will be on the ordered future, either a super capitalist system, neo-feudalist system, very much built on extending the US system as it is today, where the rich have access to longevity treatments and get access to artificial intelligence and own the assets, and then people that don't fit into this group become sort of economic slave class, like the Belters in the Expanse universe. Or we have sort of a techno-utopian, right, where we use technology to solve the problems of humanity. These are the futures that are probably going to all happen at once, simultaneously. Which of those is going to win out? I like to think technosocialism because it's more collective in its viewpoint, but it's about a 50-50 chance that neo-feudalism versus technosocialism. The problem is this. Based on what we see in science fiction, if neo-feudalism or a super-capitalist system works, most likely the chances are that the human species at some point in the next few hundred years will go extinct without focusing on optimal futures of humanity instead of making money. Because money is just a construct. It's not really real in respect to the future of humanity. So maybe government in the future will be an AI, a distributed autonomous organization, a DAO. But whatever happens with these systems that we're trying to create in the future, one thing is certain. Most of the economies of the future are going to be based on AI and are going to be machine-to-machine based. So by the 2050s, probably at least half of our global economic activity will be run by artificial intelligence. In that sense, why do we need physical currency? Why do we need plastic cards? Why do we need bank branches, ATMs, all of those things? The reality is the trajectory we're already on means that the banking system of the 21st century will be dominantly artificial intelligence. So if you're a banker, you're either in AI or you're not in business in the future. This is pretty clear. And I guess the real question in this highly autonomous world of the future, just like Edward Bellamy asked at the start, can women use it? The real question is, what role will humans have in a highly automated society when it comes to money and capital? Will humans be able to use the banking system in the future, or will it be just based on artificial intelligence? That's a question we're yet to answer, but something that we will find out in the future. So check out the book if you get a chance, The Rise of Technosocialism, but thank you very much for your time today. Okay.